Now we get to this part of the roundtable where we actually have all of our lecturers here and our guests to talk a little bit more about the issue of mechanisms of action from the standpoint of just kind of delving into some of the questions that some of our viewers, listeners, or readers out there may have with regards to this issue. I guess I'm going to start out with Dr. Goodall. And what do you believe are the most important mechanisms of action that our older, more traditional drugs represent?
Okay. Well, I think as we've discussed throughout this program, all of these drugs have multiple mechanisms of action. But I think if we look at the traditional older medications, carbamazepine, phenytoin, lamotrigine, and so forth, probably sodium channel blockade is probably the single most important mechanism that explains most of what these drugs do, both good and bad. Clearly some of our drugs have other actions in terms of GABA modulation, some of our very older medicines like phenobarbital, and again, that has downsides. But I think overall, sodium channel blockade is probably the most important mechanism.
Okay, very good. To Dr. Wexler, what different or new mechanisms do some of the newer agents bring to the table in terms of the management of epilepsy?
Well, I think the real benefit of some of the newer agents is not so much that they're always touching on a completely novel mechanism, but that they're maybe a little bit cleaner in their profile. They're a little more focused. Remember that the mechanisms of action are important for how the drug works, but they're also important for how the drug is experienced, right? So the side effects are also an issue. And when we get to some of the older drugs and their multiple mechanisms of action, we do have more tolerability issues with those older drugs as well. So I think that's really the advantage of the newer drugs is possibly a cleaner profile, better tolerability.
Okay, that's very good. To Dr. Stern, a tough question in the sense is, even though we're devoting a considerable amount of time to this concept, do mechanisms matter when making clinical decisions?
Mechanisms matter, but the embarrassing reality, I believe, is that they don't matter as much making clinical decisions as we would want them to matter. There's still a lot of work to be done in understanding the mechanisms and how they relate to spectrum of efficacy and seizure response. And so we have a lot of data about other aspects of the drug that are much more important in making clinical decisions. Toxicity and response rates for different seizure types that precede mechanisms of action in those clinical decisions.
To Dr. Goodall, and we did a roundtable separately on adverse effects, but I'm going to ask you in essence to see if there's a connection between mechanisms and the safety profile of medications. Are there any implications?
I think that there probably are. Again, I think when we again look at the drugs and they all have multiple mechanisms, I think the question becomes, as been discussed by my colleagues, that within an individual patient may have a greater or lesser response to a given drug, and that perhaps that's due to mechanism. I think when we look at the older generation medications, sodium channel blockade, the common things that I think we can attribute to that are some of the central nervous system side effects of dizziness, perhaps double vision, perhaps some sedation. I think of our other older generation medications that work on augmentation of GABA systems, such as phenobarbital, which is, as we know, very sedating and has cognitive suppression associated with it. So I think that each one of these mechanisms has the potential in individual patients. Again, GABA, increasing GABA may be a very good thing in certain parts of the brain, but as Dr. Wesher pointed out, increasing GABA concentrations perhaps in the eye may predispose some individuals to retinal toxicity.
Very good. To Dr. Wexler, you mentioned a little earlier that at the end what these new mechanisms bring to the table is kind of a cleaner profile. Do these new mechanisms, however, translate into better effectiveness of the medications?
You know, I think that it's probably too soon to tell. I think that definitely the pills don't work if the people don't take them, and the pills don't work if the doctors don't prescribe them. And when we look at the data that we have, a lot of the data is generated out of academic centers that have a high concentration of highly refractory patients that have tried many, many things. The data we have from sort of real-world clinics is more problematic at times, and we just don't have as much of it. And so we don't really have a good sense of how any of these drugs are really performing in the real world. But the more things we have to try, the more likely we are to strike on a success for each patient. We've all had patients that became seizure-free with a 10th thing we tried.
And I'm going to now bring it back to where kind of the connection to the whole picture, and to Dr. Stern, who spent his presentation talking about rational polytherapy. I'm going to ask the question: are we there yet? Did we arrive? Is there evidence, and can we tell the folks that are looking at this that this is now the moment to begin making those combinations?
I don't believe we've arrived. I believe we're still in the stage of conceptual development of rational polypharmacy. I believe that there are likely to be medication combinations that are superior, but we need to test this and understand this better in order to move forward in that direction. In the meantime, we can expect that some patients will respond to combinations better than individual monotherapies, and it becomes more of a patient-to-patient situation than one where we can say this is the combination to try overall.
Very good point and advice. Now I'm going to kind of take it to the final question for each of you all, and I'm going to start with Dr. Goodall. What take-home message, clinical pearl, do you want to make sure you impart to the folks out there that are looking or listening or reading or viewing this with regards to choosing seizure medications, particularly as it pertains to what we've been discussing today, which is mechanisms?
Great. I think an understanding of the mechanisms of action of these drugs gives us a logical starting place. And it builds a logical framework in which we can begin evaluating therapies, much as Dr. Stern is talking about. But I think the other thing that is very important, we need to recognize that epilepsy is an individual disorder. We don't have a single magic mechanism or a magic drug. And that no matter what the mechanisms of action, we need to have all of these medications available to try. Because individuals are going to respond differently. Mechanism is just a starting place. It's not the ending.
Very good. Dr. Wexler.
I absolutely agree, and I think that it's important to continue development. One of the toughest parts of my job with some of my most difficult patients, my most refractory patients, is that every time they come in, if they're not satisfied, I still have to come up with another idea. I always have to have a plan B or a plan C. And the only way I can do that is if we have new therapies that are emerging. Otherwise, I'm going to run out of things to try.
Very. Dr. Stern, last but not least.
I will build upon what Dr. Goodall and Dr. Wexler each said, and that is that for the individual patients whose seizures don't respond to the medications tried, it's a matter of continuing the process, paying attention to the science, paying attention to what new observations have been identified, and moving forward, because to not do that is to accept a disability that may not be necessary.
Well, I want to thank all of our guests, lecturers today. We've taken a very complicated topic and tried to distill it down in a manner that hopefully brings kind of a general sense of a global picture of what's going on with regards to how these seizure medications work. To all of our viewers, listeners, readers for epilepsy.com, we hope that you find this information useful. We hope that you find that somehow that there'll be some nugget, either all of it, some of it, whatever piece of it, that it translates in essence to some improvement in quality of life for whoever that is in one's life that we are either caring for or involved with with people who have epilepsy or individuals who have epilepsy. So with that, I really appreciate your attention and thank you again.